welcome to Experience Builder Behind the Scenes. I'm Wim. I'm acting as a tech lead for this project. It's the biggest, the scariest, the most ambitious, the most cutting-edge timeline-wise project I've ever worked on. But all I'm doing is really coordinating and trying to get architectural things right and making sure the foundations are solid. But it really is like just Balint and I who are standing here today, but it's a big team, more than 10 people working on it full time, as well as many contributors from outside the full-time team. And so, yeah, we're going to take you behind the scenes.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Balint. I've been making this joke that this is going to be the session about Experience Builder done by Wim and the other guy. So, boo! And I'm the other guy. Hi.
All right. So let's dive right in. What you're seeing here is we're browsing a live website, and we're going into the top bar, clicking Edit, and we're in Experience Builder. That's a really short, super high-level version of it, but we're not just going into any particular page. It's a page entity, a landing page, a structured contentless piece of data. So it's a new content entity type that Experience Builder is adding specifically for unstructured content, specifically for landing pages. And I know that was a video, and we promised in the session description that it would be live demos, but we're choosing not to do that because we would be switching back and forth all the time and making you all nauseous, especially after lunch. So we're not doing that. But everything you are seeing in the videos is real. It's recorded, but it's real. And it's actually behind where things are at today. Because, for example, in the past week or so, we made the dragging and dropping experience much, much smoother than you can see in the videos. So even though it's recorded, it's nothing fake, it's all real.
So we are inside Experience Builder now in this part of the demo, and what you see here is a React app. So Experience Builder is built in React. It's fully rendered in the browser. If you haven't seen something like that, it looks like very basic HTML markup that the backend serves, and then there's a placeholder, a div, and that's where a React app is loaded, and it does everything. But on its own, it cannot really do everything. It still has to use all the power, all the ecosystem, all the infrastructure that is there in Drupal. So it does so via HTTP endpoints, and all those HTTP endpoints are implemented as Drupal controllers.
So, as Balint just said, the UI is powered by a Drupal backend. But we have one important principle that we're adhering to throughout the Experience Builder project code base, and that is essentially keep the front end simple, or alternatively phrased, keep the Drupalisms on the server side. So we're keeping the front end intentionally very simple and free from Drupal-specific concepts so that we can iterate faster on the front end and not encumber it with all of the entire ecosystem concepts on the client side. So what you're seeing here is essentially a big canvas with panels on the right and the left-hand side, and you see two viewports, a desktop one and a mobile one. As you can have imagined, those are the things that are rendered server-side. Those are kind of like Drupal pages that you've all seen before. And yes, they're just two iframes. And yes, we thought about front-end performance because it's a single request that powers both of those previews. And as you may not have guessed, because that was a clear thing, but what you might not have guessed is that on the right-hand side, that very much looks like an entity form, right? But here's the thing, it's not actually rendered on the server.
But it is also somewhat rendered on the server. So when that form gets shown on the page, what happens is that we actually ask the Drupal backend to tell us how that form is going to look like, because we still want to rely on the existing ecosystem. We still want to use Form API. We still want to use the field widgets. So everything you see here starts their life in the rendering process on the server, aka Drupal. So Drupal is going to give us something like this. This is some special markup that we are using. This is part of a new theme engine that is introduced in Experience Builder. This markup somewhat resembles Twig templates you might notice there's something there that looks like the form element html.twig. There's something there that looks like the form element label, and finally an input. And we are mapping these to React components. So the semi-coupled theme engine, again, will give us markup that we are able to turn into React components on the front end. And why did we need to do this? Why didn't we just create an iframe just like we did it for the preview? It's because we wanted to make sure we can do real-time preview updates. So whatever you enter in the form that we are generating here will be shown and reflected in the preview real-time. We also have an undo-redo stack. So we are able to track atomic changes to the entire entity form that you are making, and we are able to undo, redo those changes and also auto-save them as you are making those changes. So that's why we needed this new system.
So you all are engineers, or I'm guessing since you're attending Drupal Dev Days. And I bet you're thinking currently of the most complex content entity form that you've ever worked on. And you're probably wondering that thing that's not going to work in there. I hear confirmation of my hypothesis. But we got you. We are determined to definitely make sure by 1.0 that every core form element and every core field widget is going to work. Now, I say core specifically, not contrib and custom. We are committed to making that work as well. Made it work from day one. May require either no changes in many cases or minimal changes in some cases. But we are, of course, taking that into consideration. But we are starting with just the core field widgets, because what you see on the right-hand side there, it currently still looks very simple. It's only for the very few form elements that exist for a page content entity, which, as I mentioned before, has no structured data, it just has a title, some SEO stuff, a URL alias, and the component tree. So there's little in there, intentionally so, because it's supposed to be about that landing page. But at DrupalCon a month ago, in that content entity form, if we were to look at something else in a page content entity, then very few things were working, relatively speaking, and we're currently well on our way to 100% of the core field widgets working in the content entity form with end-to-end task coverage. So we're thinking about all of those crazy edge cases that we know exist out there. So I was talking about the page content entity type, and I just mentioned that there is a component tree there. That's the thing that you were seeing on the screen. Now we've been talking a lot about that rectangle on the right-hand side, if you will. It's the page data tab, which represents the entity form of the entity you're currently looking at. So let's shift to another rectangle on the screen. A landing page, that's supposed to be a kind of one-off thing where every landing page might look completely different, but even landing pages, of course, need to have some consistency between them. Typically, I would think about site-wide navigation. Every page, no matter whether it's a landing page or something else, needs some site-wide navigation. And so Drupal has a well-established mechanism for that I think probably everyone in the room has used, and that is theme regions, the block module, block plugins that are provided by the block module or other modules, and the block placement UI. Show of hands who's used the block placement UI, admin structure block. Really, not everyone? I'm surprised. Okay, but now keep your hands in the air and now drop them unless, well, okay, that's not double negation. Hands up in the air if you like using the block placement UI. Okay, yeah, there we go. So that's the purpose, or that's the reason I'm talking about this. So Experience Builder allows you to say, for this particular theme, we're going to make Experience Builder take over theme regions. And that's why there is a page region config entity thing up there. And so the idea is that then you choose to opt in for a particular theme. You choose which regions you want to make editable inside of Experience Builder, because part of the problem with the block placement UI is that it surfaces every single theme region. That can be very easily very overwhelming, especially when a site chooses to not actually use some of those theme regions. So we allow that decision to be made up front. And maybe some of you noticed on the left-hand side that there were some green pieces of text that said header, content, and footer. Those are the different regions appearing inside of Experience Builder. So basically, what that means is we're going to offer a much better experience to populate those theme regions. We're not going to make you use the block placement UI. We still are going to allow you to use those block plugins you had before. And actually, if you had blocks placed into theme regions before, we're going to bring those over into Experience Builder automatically. The difference is, though, that whereas the block module and the way that it allows you to populate each region, that was a list of block plugins. And so it's a sequence of things. And that is not the case anymore in Experience Builder. In Experience Builder, everything is a component tree, including everything inside of a region. So what that means is the thing that you're seeing up there in that rectangle, like I think every one of you is probably thinking, well, that's a menu block, styled in a particular way. But actually, in Experience Builder, like just looking at this visually, you wouldn't be able to say that with certainty. It could just as well be a 6-column component in which there is first a Drupal image, then there's 4 hard-coded links, and then there is a call to action kind of thing. There is no way to tell because it could be a tree of components. You can assemble whatever you like in each region. And so it's component trees that really are important here, even though visually you can't really tell. Let's move on to a different rectangle on the screen, the one below the site-wide navigation. Well, this is actually the content region, and on the left-hand side, it's kind of obscured right now, but you can see that it says, or the content region is uncollapsed, so in the layers panel, you can see the different components. And so the content region is kind of special. In the past, the content region was just like any other region, and with the block placement UI, you could place whatever the hell you wanted in there. We're choosing to make that simpler. We're choosing to not let you put anything in the content region. What we're doing is we're just exposing whatever the controller on a specific route is returning. That appears in the content region, the main content block from before. And that's it. You cannot customize it further. That means that for a content author, it's much more consistent, much more predictable what is in there. The content that they're going to, that they're editing, it appears in the content region. And currently, like you can see that it says XB field. So I'm currently looking at a page content entity. And so what really is happening is I'm seeing the XB field entity, nothing else. The component tree contained inside of an XB field is what is being visualized there. That's the case for when you're looking at an individual content entity. And now I'm going to give you a peek behind a future curtain, because it's called behind the scenes, but it's kind of a future scene because it doesn't really exist yet. But we are currently working on, and the number of pieces of infrastructure have landed, for bringing content templates into Experience Builder. What that is you're going to be able to specify what the component tree is going to be, what every product or every article or every blog post, whatever the content type might be, is going to end up using. The difference is that instead of assigning specific values to it, you're going to map structured data into it. So you're going to use this same familiar at some point, I promise, user experience. You're going to map structured data into pieces of the component tree. And then you're going to be able to see, as you navigate to different pages or different products, see the structured data of those pieces of content appear in there. So the reason I'm giving you that peek behind the curtain is we are thinking ahead with every piece of UI that we're building of the future things to come. Now, I mentioned the word component tree a number of times. What is that? Well, a component tree is really the fundamental concept that everything around Experience Builder is built upon, and that what the user interface is allowing to create. Because in the end, assembling all of those single directory components and blocks and other kinds of components together in one cohesive visual whole, like it needs to be stored somewhere, and it needs to have some data structure. That's what we call a component tree. A component tree, without going into full detail, if you want a full detail, go check out the data model.md file in the docs directory. But it consists of 2 parts, a tree and inputs. The tree part contains the structure that defines which exact combinations of components you're using and how you're combining them and putting them in one another or adjacent to one another. So it's purely structure. And then inputs defines what the inputs are for each individual component in that tree. For a block, that could be the settings for a block. For an SEC, it would be values for the individual props. And in the future, it could be other things. What is crucial here is that component trees are kind of complex on the server side. But as I mentioned before, we're going to keep the Drupalisms on the server side and keeping the front end simple. So that's what we're doing here. The client doesn't have any inkling of an idea what it takes to render such a component. That's the server-side concern. The client only has to think about what the different components are that are available, what kind of inputs they need, whether they have slots or not, whether you can stack them on one another. And so the client can remain simple and can have a simple experience. So component trees, they contain components. And where do those come from? Well, we talked about a number of components already, and in Experience Builder, and this is the other really crucial thing, everything is a component. Blocks, we know that that's a thing, we know that that exists, but as far as Experience Builder is concerned, that's a term that doesn't ever appear. It doesn't exist at all. Because everything is supposed to be components so that it's mental model-wise very simple to combine the different components together. And where do components come from? Well, that's where component sources come in. And on the screen, you see the three that we currently have listed. Blocks, block plugins are made available as components. Single directory components, that's one that you probably all know as well. And then there's a third that Experience Builder adds, kind of like single directory components, but entirely in browser code components. And so essentially, component sources allow bringing in any kind of visible unit, if you will, that allows you to compose them together into something bigger. And so it's really a powerful abstraction that allows many future things to be added in the future. Currently, we're restricted to these three, but in the future, it will be possible to add more component sources. And an obvious one is because I think many of you have sites powered by Layer Builder, show of hands. Okay, and paragraphs. Okay, yeah, see, so all of you who raised your hands at least once, you've got a need for an upgrade path or a migration path. And so this is a piece of the infrastructure that will help you go from what you have today into Experience Builder. And we're intending to do it in a way that you're not going to have to go through a very painful and complex, probably, migration, but instead allow you to upgrade into Experience Builder. And lots of details to be determined. Like, this is talking about it in the abstract. We don't have concrete code for this yet. But you can imagine that, for example, for Layered Builder is powered by layered plugins. Layered plugins can just be another component source so that it allows you to transition that existing tree of things into Experience Builder. So lots of details to be determined still. Now, I talked about blocks in specific, so I'm going to show you the fact that Experience Builder has different libraries of components, and dynamic components is exactly where blocks appear. Dynamic because they contain logic. I just dragged in a views block, and note that I didn't see the word block anywhere. The block settings appear on the right-hand side. I changed the number of items per page, and it updated.
And now, I'm supposed to talk about single directory components. I'm a bit nervous because one of the people who created SDC is here. Pierre just walked in at the beginning of the session, so no pressure, huh? So I'm actually not sure how much details we need to go in here, because SDCs, they have been around for 2 years. So who here has does use SDCs? Okay, so not everyone. So the concept here is, so zoom out a bit of the word component that we have heard before. It's a bit of an overused term in software engineering. But single directory components is Drupal's answer to component-driven front-end architecture. It's a system that allows you to place some files in, well, you guessed, a single directory, and then it, as a component, gets exposed to your theming system, your render arrays, and other systems, in this case, Experience Builder. And the two most important files, I have an example up here. This is a simple card component. There is a component.yaml file that contains metadata about my component, and there is a twig file that controls the output of my component. And the most important parts of the component metadata are props and slots. In this case, I have props for allowing this card to receive a title. When I say receive, it's an input. It can receive it from a render array. It can receive it from another twig template, or in our case, you will see in Experience Builder from a component props form. So we also have a date for this simple card component that it can receive, and you can see how I mapped these metadata parts to different parts of the twig template where we make use of them. And I also have a variant prop here that is really just changing a CSS class in the Twig template. Because of course, you can also couple this with a CSS file and a JavaScript file, and that is a single directory component. But there is another very important part of SDCs, and that is a slot. You can also define slots. In this case, I want my simple cart components to be able to receive its content in a slot, meaning that you can place other SDCs in it, or some other rendered content in your template in any other way. This is how we achieve composability. And just to give you a visual example of how this simple cart component looks like, in Experience Builder, you just drag it onto the page, and then you can enter a title for it, which was a prop that I showed you before. You can select a date to be presented, which I also showed you before, and you can select a variant, which is controlling that CSS class, which is controlling the color of this very simple cart component that I have.
So you saw in the video that form on the right-hand side. We're going to take a look at that. Before we were talking about the content entity form, that bigger form on the right-hand side, and Balint explained how that is using the semi-coupled theme engine, and the same is true here. Now, the question is, how did we even get to a form in the first place? Because the SDC only defined metadata in that YAML file. It defined props and slots, and I'm only going to dig into props here. But how did we go from that metadata in the YAML file to that form on the right-hand side? Well, that's where the concept of prop shape matching comes in. So an SDC can contain any number of props, and in the example that Balint gave, there's 3. The first one is just title, and it has a title. It has a type, and the title and type together are kind of what hints towards what an appropriate widget would be. Like, it's a string, so you want a string field type and a string field widget, and you need a label for that field widget. In this case, that's like not very original, title. So title appears inside the field widget on the right-hand side. And the example value, so you can see that there is one example. It's called cart title. The first example for something is automatically used as a default. Maybe you spotted that in the video. When Balint dragged the component onto the canvas, it first showed cart title. And so all that metadata is pretty good use, if you will, but it's not quite that simple, because type string is very broad, but not every string is the same as another string. A string could be a URL, it could be a date, it could be freeform, it could be some obscure ISO standard. No matter what it is, in this case, it's constrained by that format. It's a date, so it should use a date field type and a date widget. I pressed the wrong button. And the third prop is variance, and here it's constrained by that enum. That enum lists an enumeration of possible values. And so each of those describes something about the kinds of inputs that are acceptable versus not, but we need to translate that to field types and widgets, because that's the other promise of Experience Builder, that we're trying to bring the entire ecosystem along and making it relevant still, and making sure that any investments, any work you've done on making awesome field widgets still is usable inside of Experience Builder. And so that's what's going on here. We're trying to distill from the JSON schema in an SEC metadata file from each of those props and those sub-JSON schemas, because this is looking at just the JSON schema for the variant prop. We're normalizing that and standardizing it and distilling it down to the essence, and that's what we call a prop shape. The shape of the prop, regardless of irrelevant details, if you will. And so in the example of a type string and an enum, what we end up doing is we try to find the corresponding field type. In this case, it would be string list or list string, and then a widget that works for that field type, and ta-da, that's how we arrive at the thing on the right-hand side, a drop-down that lists the 2 possible values of the enum. Now, this is the simple, superficial explanation, if you will, because this actually goes further. Under the hood, and this is not visible anywhere yet in the Experience Builder UI today, but I mentioned content templates before. And for content templates, we need to make sure that we actually match against actual data that actually exists already. So we need to match against field instances, meaning base fields, bundle fields, configurable fields on individual content entity types and bundles of content entity types, to find the things that actually match that shape. And that is also prop shape matching. So it's really not just given some kind of shape, selecting a field type and then generating it. It's also finding existing instances to offer those to be put into and present using an SEC. So what you can imagine probably is that not every single shape is going to be supported or not supported out of the gate. All the primitive types are covered, very common ones like URLs and string enums, like surprisingly common, or maybe not surprisingly, in SECs it's very common to see those. What isn't yet supported is type array, which kind of is JSON schema speak for multi-value things, so multiple strings or multiple integers, that kind of thing. Object support is not there, but that kind of like is going to be a tricky, somewhat open question, because with JSON schema you can define insanely complicated, super deep object shapes. Does it really make sense to offer corresponding field widgets on the right-hand side? Probably not. But so prop shape matching is what is powering all of this, and the most common additional shapes, if you will, that are somewhat more complex are also explicitly supported. Image is perhaps the most notable one. It can be matched against both an image field and image widgets, or media library, or I should say entity reference fields to a media entity constrained to just images. That is working as well. But so there's different choices you could make, because maybe you on your side don't want to use media library, or maybe you don't want to use a date widget or Drupal core's default date widget. Maybe you want to use a different date widget. It is possible to choose to override the choices that Experience Builder makes by default. So given that prop shapes, like not every prop shape maybe has a corresponding field type or widget, how do we make sure that only the components that we can actually make work well in Experience Builder appear for the content author to use and the site builder? Well, that's where the concept of requirements for component sources come in. Because, for example, if we didn't have a title for a given prop, how would we generate a sensible label for the field widgets? Like, that would be impossible. And for each prop in an SEC that is marked as required, that means that the SEC absolutely, or declares at least, that it needs it in order for it to be able to render at all. If there isn't an initial value, then how could Experience Builder generate a preview, which you maybe saw when Balint was hovering over the left-hand side and like looking at what each component looks like? That preview, it needs the necessary inputs for that preview to be generated. And so depending on the component source and the characteristics of the component source, different requirements may be imposed. And for SECs, these are two of the most prominent examples. So your SECs that you're writing today, they will work in Experience Builder, assuming that you maybe add a little bit metadata to allow Experience Builder to generate a decent authoring experience. But yeah, generally, any work you do today with an SEC either requires no additional work to make them appear in Experience Builder, or a little bit of metadata additions. And so, I was talking about component sources before, and I was just talking about requirements. So the question is, where can you find all your components? Well, under Appearance Components, you find the list of components that Experience Builder discovers automatically that are available, that are meeting the requirements. And then under the Disabled Components tab, you'll find, in this case, a much longer list of components that do not meet the requirements. So for example, for block plugins, we require that the settings for a block plugin are fully validatable, because how else can Experience Builder be confident about the data it's storing for a block? And the thing that is kind of in the middle of the screen there with a long piece of text, that's Experience Builder saying, sorry, this is a complex shape that I do not have a match for. So it precisely tells you what is and what isn't supported and why, so that you can act on it.
So the one thing we didn't cover about this sample card component that I showed you before is the slot and how that looks on the UI. So that is what I'm talking about, and just a recap of how that was in the metadata file. And so Experience Builder presents that with that light blue rectangle, and you are able to drag other components into that slot. So that is what I meant by composability, or by embedding arbitrary content in your slot. And in this case, I just pulled in a paragraph component provided by the Starshot demo design system, and I just configured the props of that component, how that should appear inside of that slot.
Now, you may want to sometimes be kind of happy with something you build and not want to recreate it all. So here is an example of something that is quite complex, like a fairly deep component tree, if you will. And like this subset, I want to be able to reuse. And what I can do then is I can right-click it and create a section out of it. A section is kind of a reusable piece that you can reapply anywhere you like. And so under the hood, that is another config entity, the pattern config entity. And really all it contains is a name and a component tree. And it allows you to reuse that anywhere. So here you can see dragging in that same subtree into some other place and have it be ready to use and look exactly the same and be customizable again because it's not tied back to the original. So it's kind of like recipes in the sense that you apply it and then there is no further connection. It's a starting point, an insertable starting point.
So we've introduced the component sources, and we have covered two so far. So we covered blocks and SDCs, and it is time to JavaScript. And so the third component source was written on the screen when Wim was explaining how all that works as in-browser code components. They are written in JavaScript. So that is a very new way of creating front-end components in Drupal. And before we jump into that, here is my simple card component again on the left, written in Twig. And on the right, you see how it would look like as if it was implemented in React. So I just wanted to show you that quick comparison just to give you an idea of how that looks. And of course, in case of SDCs, we all know how to create those. You create those files in a single directory, but they are in your file system and they are meant to be created by developers. And we might be changing that a bit with JavaScript components. Of course, the target audience is still mostly developers, but maybe some other people would like to play with JavaScript code, which these days you can easily get from LLMs. And so we took a different approach with JavaScript components. We implemented them in the browser, meaning that the primary way is for you to use an in-browser code editor that is embedded in Experience Builder. And here's a demo for how that looks. So you can start by creating a new component, and I just named it Simple Card, and I am now pasting that React code that I just showed you on a previous slide. There is some global CSS that I can define with some CSS variables. And there's CSS written specifically for this component. And then I get a live preview in the browser. So this is done using WebAssembly. We are actually compiling React code in the browser using WebAssembly. There's a live preview there. And what you see now is the UI for you to create something like the component.yaml file. So you can define your props. You can define what is required. You can define the enum options, for example, here. And you can set the example values. Example values, we mentioned that they are very important for Experience Builder because we need to know how to render your component from the get-go. And of course, you can also define slots. And here, because it's arbitrary content in the code editor, you can just enter any HTML and get a preview of how that looks. Now I wanted to show you a bit more complex example. Here I'm just adding a container just as a preparation for something that's coming. And this is a pricing table component that I created. And here you will see that I am going to the global CSS and I'm going to change that to become Tailwind CSS config. So Tailwind CSS is supported in Experience Builder in the in-browser code editor for code components. And for Tailwind CSS version 4, the configuration format is CSS variables. So we just reuse the global CSS as our theme directive for Tailwind and change that. And here you see a highly interactive component that users can use. And I defined a lot of props which will become available for customizing this pricing table to your needs. And once you're done, you just add it to your components, which means it shows up in your library, and it is ready to be used right away in the browser. You didn't have to do anything else. and you can just drag it on to your content. And here you can see I exposed a slot for its heading area, and I just dragged in another component for its heading. That component is from the Starshot demo design system. It's the heading component, and I'm just defining its props here. And then I will finally get a preview of it. And my favorite detail here is that, so that component, the pricing table, was implemented in React in the browser. I just dragged it on, and then I used an SDC in one of its slots. So we just mixed and matched React and SDC twig from Drupal. So to recap everything about code components, currently we support preact, and we alias React to preact. So what that means is preact is a lightweight drop-in replacement of React. That's a nice frame of reference for it. It's 3 kilobytes in total. It doesn't contain all the advanced features of React that you probably don't need for these types of components, like the shadow DOM and many other features in React. So we just render everything using preact's compatibility layer in case we have to, if someone is importing a package from React, so we're able to alias that. So I was able to tell you it's React, it's kind of sort of true, and it will just work through preact's compatibility layer. And the way we made that happen on the front end is we used code from a framework called Astro. Astro has this concept of Astro Islands, and it has code to hydrate those components in your browser. So we use this Astro Island hydration technique to get these components onto your page. We create the necessary files for the hydration, we create the necessary markup, and everything ends up in your browser that way. But because we rely on Astro, Astro is famous of being able to handle many frameworks. We will be able to add support for other frameworks as well. Because of course, the minute we introduced this in React, people started asking, but can you do Vue? Can you do Svelte and others? And the answer is yes, in the future, this is all possible. So the architecture allows it. So CSS support. We did add Tailwind CSS version 4. I mentioned that. That's happening in the browser, the entire Tailwind compilation. And no, it's not using the Tailwind CDN version, the Play version. This is actual proper Tailwind compilation in the browser, which means that your markup is getting explored by Tailwind, and we only generate the classes that you need there. But besides Tailwind, which of course is optional, you don't have to use it. If you write regular CSS, we still do some transpiling of that CSS to make life easier for you. So there is auto prefixing built in, and you can also use more modern syntax, and we syntax lower it for browser compatibility. So CSS support is already there. There is some work left to do in case you give this a try today. The way we process the global CSS when it comes to the Tailwind configuration is a bit suboptimal, so we're working on that. I just wanted to highlight that here. If you see some CSS duplication, that's because there's still some work left to do, but there's an issue for that on Drupal.org, and there's a clear path to achieving that. And I haven't mentioned imports. So what do I mean by imports? In Twig terminology, this would be the equivalent of Twig embed, meaning that, let's say I have a hero component that I implemented in React, and I want to pull in another component, import another component that I also implemented in React, maybe a button component, and I want to make that as part of my hero component without using a slot, because that's how I would like to author it as the component author. Then we are talking about first-party imports in this case, and we have just made really good progress this week on it. First-party imports are coming, so you will be able to import other code components inside your code components, and we have plans for making third-party imports happen, potentially via CDNs, things like esm.sh, using direct URL imports. You would be able to import packages from NPM, or maybe in the future we will allow modules to ship their own dependencies, their own packages, which they want the code components to import. So there are plans to make all of that happen. But maybe one of the most interesting parts for the developer audience is, okay, but what if you don't want to use the in-browser code editor because you just want to use your own development environment and you want to write your components in whatever JS framework you want, and you want to make sure that you bundle it, you compile it, you take care of everything, but you want to be able to use it in Experience Builder. So there is a CLI tool coming very soon that will allow you to import these components into your Drupal instance, because in Drupal, they actually exist as config entities. So with this CLI tool, you will be able to create the config entities, to expose them to Experience Builder, and then you can work with them from that on. So another concept I wanted to talk to you about is how to extend the UI of Experience Builder. So we have a very experimental API to do that, to change how things work within Experience Builder, to add to the UI, to work with the content that you currently have. And I think it's telling that you need to enable an XB_dev mode module to make that available. And then there is a test extension that is really just a demonstration of what is possible when you enable that. And I have a short demo of that. So once you enable the XB_dev mode module, you get this extensions widget appearing. And then an extension can be open, can provide UI to be presented in this model. And really this demo extension, what it does, it has access to your layout, so the content that's currently laid out on your page. And it is able to focus one of those items, or delete them, add to them, do all sorts of things. So this is all demonstrated by this module. And the way we made this happen is really exposing a very low-level API, exposing an API that the XB React app itself uses. So if you're familiar with React, you might have heard of the library called Redux. So Redux is a state management solution for React, and state management is a fancy word of describing data that lives in your browser, that describes how your UI is supposed to present content, present data currently. So for example, the user makes some choices in your app, selects a tab, selects a component. We store all of these in the Redux store. And Redux has this state where other apps, including the Experience Builder app, can subscribe to and get access to that data. So this way you get access to what's currently visible in your content, which component is being currently selected. You can update its inputs. You can do all sorts of actions. And really, the high-level overview of Redux is that you have everything stored in this state, and you can dispatch actions. So the actions are also available to you. An action would be, for example, add this component to the layout. And then within the Redux store, we have reducers, which again is a fancy word for pure functions that can just deal with an action payload and mutate the state. And all of this is probably not going to be that important in the long-term future, because we will expose more purpose-made, more targeted APIs to do things with Experience Builder. But this is where we started, because we already wanted to explore how extensions can be built, or what extensions even want to do with Experience Builder. You might have seen in the Dries note, there is already an AI extension. Jamie made a video about it. An AI extension for generating code for an in-browser code component. So that was done using this API. So again, this is very experimental. It's not a stable API. It is going to change, but it is there if you want to give it a try. And with that, we are ready for a recap.
Yep. So the concepts that we covered are essentially covered by these 8 squares. but I'm going to go over them to like connect things a little bit more for you. So the page content entity type is a new content entity type with no structured data. It actually is impossible to add new fields to it, and intentionally so, because it's supposed to be used only for landing pages, so only title, URL, alias, some SEO stuff, and a component tree. Entity forms. They're still the same, but they're rendered completely differently to allow for that undo integration and so on that Balint covered. Global regions. It's the term that we use in Experience Builder's UI, but it's really just theme regions, but restricted to those that you opt into, that you want to expose. And a global region stores its data in a page region config entity, and that's a first kind of component tree. Actually, the very first one was on the page entity type. There, too, is a component tree. The page entity type actually uses an XB field for storing that component tree. So the XB field type is the only way to store a component tree inside of content. Everything else is component trees stored in config. We have multiple types of component sources, and SDCs are the most prominent one there, but blocks is another example. But in order to make SDCs and in-browser code components actually have an authoring experience, meaning widgets to get stuff in there, to put data into the props, we have the concept of prop shape matching. What you've seen today is the use of kind of conjured out of thin air fields that are stored in that component tree. But in the future, once we have content templates, which is not on there, but it's coming, that will actually store just kind of descriptions that say it's supposed to come from this field or even this value in the field of that content entity type. So prop matching, prop shape matching, is how we allow you to not have to worry about it as a front developer while creating SDCs and in-browser code components. Now, a bunch of times I've mentioned config entities, and page regions are one of them. Patterns are another. That's the sections concept in the UI. But there's also JavaScript components, and that's actually the thing underneath in-browser code components. That's how they can exist, how they can be stored. And crucial is how they can be shared. Because that's a thing that is not on these slides and not mentioned anywhere else before. But remember that listing where you could see all of the enabled components and the disabled components. Every enabled component actually also has a config entity. It's a component config entity. And that's the way that we are able to track whether all of the dependencies of that, for example, SDC-powered SDC-powered components actually still exist. So ensuring that the module providing the SDC, the module providing the field type for the first prop, the module providing the widget for the second prop, like making sure that all of those things are actually present, that is tracked through config dependencies, so that when you deploy, say, a content template and a page region that depend on various kinds of components, whether block or SDC, and they themselves and use field types and widgets, that all of those things are actually present when you deploy to a new site. So that's how we guarantee robustness, and we use config validation to ensure it really all is well connected and correct. In-browser code components allow you to make changes, significant visual changes on a site without code deployments, and offer a much smoother developer experience from some points of view, depending on what your use case is. And then the super experimental thing that Balint mentioned, extensions. Lots of work to be done there. But so there's lots of concepts, but there's also lots of concepts that you still recognize. We're just recombining them in a different way to offer a better user experience. So I think it's pretty clear that I'm more on the backend side of things and Balint more on the front-end side of things. So we'll be happy to answer any questions you might have now for a little while longer, or come find us in the contrib room later today. Thank you. Anybody wants to ask some questions except Gabor? Or Gabor has a ton of questions, it seems.
So this looks great. I want to start using it yesterday. How can I get onto Experience Builder? How can I move my site to Experience Builder?
You can play with it, but you cannot start using it yet unless you really like losing data and lots of PC breaks. So you got to be patient while we are working our asses off to make this an actual full, stable reality.
There is an initiative for migration, migrating from layout builder and paragraphs. It's led by Kristen Paul. She is very happy to hear about any ideas regarding DX, UX of how to make this happen. And until then, the best way to play with Experience Builder is via a GitHub repository, which we should have linked on one of the slides, but we didn't. So I will send it into the Dev Days channel. That works.
Hey, this was fun. I was excited to see this entity fields being rendered as these sort of, in the theme, as these custom elements. But really curious, how are you saving the data back? Is that through a custom API? Or how do you get the entity data saved on the back end?
So that actually is still using the entity form controller under the hood. So it's really executing for the content entity form. It really is using all of the same form API stuff and all of that same logic, because re-implementing all of that would not be possible to like make automatically work.
Oh wow, okay, so you're just like posting form data.
Yeah,
yes,
for the content entity form, it is that simple. Like we discovered some scary things in Form API along the way, but
Really?
yeah, really. It required only a few core committers to figure out how to actually make it work, and it was Lee who figured out the last bit of it 2 days ago.
Hi, this is amazing. Like, actually, like, just to the whole team, like, you've done a fantastic amount of work in such a short period of time, so just congratulations to everybody on this. Yeah. Okay, praise is over, now I have a real question. No, it's just, I just wondered, so if I understand it correctly, with is it templates? What did you call them? Content templates?
Content templates.
Is that essentially, is it correct to say those essentially replace display modes and how you arrange fields? Is that the intention with those then?
You will not be arranging fields in the sense that arranging fields was a sequential kind of thing, where you choose a field formatter and you arrange them in a sequence. Here you would be mapping them into the component tree. But yes, it will be the successor to entity view displays. Yes.
Yeah, cool.
Does it work? I've got a second. This is absolutely fantastic. So the one thing I was wondering, what is this going to mean for the cache API, like the relations there, and what is this going to mean for performance? If everything's already rendered client side, or a lot of it?
So are you asking about the rendering inside Experience Builder UI, or are you asking about
No, not
visiting
necessarily,
as an
right?
end
Like,
user?
so things are rendered on the client side, but what is this going to mean for performance, right? Like, what's the cache API inside Drupal still going to play a role in anything here?
It's a good question, and actually just I think last week I discovered / realized, or actually I think it was Catch, core committer Catch, who pointed out that the way that we are currently rendering block plugins through the Experience Builder block component source, that we're actually kind of forgetting about the whole lazy builder work that we did many years ago to allow for deferred rendering and big pipe integration and so on. So we need to fix that. But that is not going to go away. Like, that's still going to work as is. But if you're referring to in-browser code components, then yes, those are going to be rendered client-side. But that doesn't mean that cacheability concerns are completely gone.
Right, so not all of these components are going to be rendered client-side. That's
not all, no.
Okay.
Yeah, block plugin, we didn't figure out how to make PHP run on the client side, magically executing block plugins.
Right, so you're going to like get cached snippets specifically for React, and then
it's essentially going to be the same, I think, as any other rendering. It's just going to be an Astro Island, and
yes, correct. It's really just a markup of that Astro Island that we will cache in Drupal. But I should say that we are aware of the potential downsides of rendering those components only in the browser, and because of that, we have plans to introduce fundamental support for server-side rendering, which means, because it's JavaScript, it means that it will require Node.js on the server. It's going to be optional, but the fundamental support to achieve that will be there, and that will address the concerns of rendering in the browser, because then we can just pre-render everything on the server.
so right there.
But so the cacheability aspects, those, like, everything can
Still
work,
gonna play a
continue
major
to work
role.
the same way. It's just that some like when you have a lot of JavaScript components, sorry, in-browser code components, when they are going to be served with some markup, but then also some JavaScript that gets loaded, and then the actual rendering happens client-side, yes. But that doesn't mean that there's more server load necessarily, because that's still, like, much of it can be coming from page cache and dynamic page cache.
Good. Well, that answered my question. Thanks.
Cool. Everything has been answered, apparently, or
So
we need to wrap, I think?
Yeah, we got the sign to wrap. Thank you, everyone. And one important thing, we are planning to release the stable version of this by Vienna. So that is also going to be an answer to Gabor's question.
Yes. And like the people raising their hands that were still having
Yes, we
questions,
are
come
here.
find us in the contrib room after this. Thanks.